Good evening. In 2026, a landmark Supreme Court decision sent shockwaves through the world of American trade policy, fundamentally altering the balance of power between the executive and legislative branches. The ruling was the culmination of years of legal battles and political debate, and its impact was felt not only in Washington but across the global economy. The court ruled that President Trump's use of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEPA, to impose sweeping tariffs on foreign goods was unconstitutional. This decision challenged the very foundation of how emergency powers had been interpreted for decades and called into question the limits of presidential authority in economic matters. The case began when a coalition of businesses and state governments challenged the president's authority to levy tariffs on imports without explicit congressional approval. They argued that such actions violated the separation of powers, undermining the checks and balances that are central to the Constitution. The administration had invoked IEPA, a law originally designed for targeted sanctions during national emergencies, to justify broad and sweeping tariffs. By bypassing Congress, the executive branch claimed unprecedented control over trade policy, raising alarms among lawmakers and legal scholars alike. Lower courts consistently sided with the challengers, finding that the president had overreached his constitutional authority. These rulings set the stage for a historic showdown at the nation's highest court. In a decisive 6-3 decision, the Supreme Court reaffirmed that the power to tax and regulate international trade rests squarely with Congress, not the president. The majority opinion emphasized the importance of maintaining the constitutional balance of power, especially in matters that affect the nation's economy. The ruling underscored that even in times of crisis or uncertainty, the constitutional limits on executive power must be respected. It sent a clear message that no president is above the law, and that the separation of powers remains a cornerstone of American democracy. This marked a turning point in American trade policy, effectively ending a controversial era of unilateral trade actions and restoring Congress's central role in shaping the nation's economic future. President Trump's administration viewed decades of persistent trade deficits as more than just an economic issue. They saw them as a direct threat to both national security and long-term American prosperity. The administration argued that the U.S. was losing its competitive edge, with critical industries and jobs moving overseas, leaving the country vulnerable in times of crisis. In response, they imposed sweeping tariffs on a wide range of imported goods, from steel and aluminum to electronics and consumer products. The goal was to make foreign goods more expensive, encouraging consumers and businesses to buy American-made products instead. By doing so, the administration hoped to revive domestic manufacturing, protect American jobs, and reduce reliance on imports. But the tariffs weren't just about economics, they were also a strategic tool. The administration used them as leverage, aiming to pressure other countries into negotiating more favorable trade agreements for the United States. The hope was that tough measures would force trading partners to address long-standing grievances over unfair practices and market access. However, the tariffs quickly sparked backlash at home. American businesses, especially those relying on imported materials or selling goods abroad, argued that the new costs were crippling their operations. Many warned that higher prices would be passed on to consumers, making everyday goods more expensive and threatening jobs in industries that depended on global trade. For many companies, global supply chains had become essential. They couldn't simply switch to domestic sources overnight, and the tariffs disrupted carefully balanced networks that had taken years to build. This created uncertainty and forced some businesses to rethink their entire operations. The controversy soon moved to the courts. Legal challenges focused on whether the president actually had the authority to impose what amounted to new taxes on his own, without explicit approval from Congress. Critics argued that such sweeping action overstepped executive power. Plaintiffs contended that the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEPA, was designed for targeted sanctions in times of crisis, not for rewriting the nation's trade policy or imposing broad tariffs. They warned that allowing the executive branch to act unilaterally in this way would undermine Congress's constitutional authority over trade and taxation, setting a dangerous precedent for the future. All of this set the stage for a high-stakes legal battle, with the courts now tasked with deciding who truly controls U.S. trade policy, the president or Congress. The legal fight began in the U.S. Court of International Trade, a specialized court in New York City that handles cases involving international trade and customs laws. Here, the stakes were high, as the outcome would affect not only the businesses involved, but also the broader relationship between the executive and legislative branches of government. In this courtroom, businesses and states argued that the president had exceeded the authority granted by the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEPA. They insisted that the president's actions went far beyond what Congress had intended when it passed the law. Their main claim was that IEPA was never meant to let the executive branch create a parallel tariff system, bypassing Congress's constitutional power to regulate taxes and trade. They feared this would set a dangerous precedent, allowing future presidents to impose sweeping economic measures without proper oversight. The government, on the other hand, countered that IEPA's broad language was intentionally designed to allow the president to act swiftly in times of economic emergency, when waiting for Congress could be too slow to address urgent threats. After careful consideration, the court sided with the challengers. The judge ruled that tariffs are, in fact, a form of tax, a power that the Constitution reserves for Congress alone. This decision sent shockwaves through the legal and business communities. The case then moved to the Federal Circuit Court of Appeals, where a panel of judges reviewed the lower court's decision. The appellate court upheld the ruling, emphasizing the importance of maintaining checks and balances, and warning against giving the president what they called a blank check to impose tariffs. Despite these rulings, the tariffs remained in place during the lengthy appeals process. This prolonged period of uncertainty left business owners, workers, and entire industries unsure about the future, as they waited for a final resolution. Recognizing the massive economic and constitutional stakes, the Supreme Court agreed to hear the case. The nation watched closely, knowing that the court's decision would have far-reaching consequences for the balance of power in government. In a landmark decision, the Supreme Court struck down the tariffs, ending years of legal limbo and uncertainty for businesses and workers across the country. The court's ruling made it clear that even in times of emergency, the president's powers are not unlimited. There are constitutional boundaries that must be respected. For those who had fought for clear limits on executive authority, it was a hard-won victory, one that reaffirmed the importance of checks and balances in American democracy. At the heart of the case was a fundamental question: who controls trade and taxes? The Constitution gives Congress, not the President, the power to tax and regulate commerce with foreign nations. The framers, wary of unchecked executive power, placed the power of the purse in the legislative branch. Plaintiffs argued the President's use of IEPA blurred these lines, threatening the separation of powers. The administration claimed Congress had delegated this authority through IEPA's broad language. But the Supreme Court ruled that such delegation must be clear and specific, especially for core legislative powers. The court found IEPA lacked the necessary language to authorize sweeping tariffs. The ruling reaffirmed that setting taxes and trade policy is Congress's responsibility. Vague statutes cannot justify a wholesale transfer of power to the executive. The EP, passed in 1977, was designed for targeted sanctions against foreign threats, not for broad trade policy. Historically, presidents used it to freeze assets or block transactions, not to impose tariffs on everyday goods. The Trump administration argued that trade deficits were an extraordinary threat, justifying tariffs under IEPA. Challengers countered that tariffs are taxes, and IEPA was never meant to grant such sweeping authority. The Supreme Court agreed, finding no clear congressional intent to allow the president to rewrite tariff schedules. The ruling restored IEPA to its original narrow purpose. It closed the door on using emergency powers for unilateral trade wars. Anticipating defeat in court, the administration pivoted to Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962. This law lets the president impose tariffs if imports threaten national security, a standard courts rarely challenge. After the Supreme Court struck down the IEPA tariffs, the administration launched new Section 232 investigations. Targets included semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, green energy, and heavy machinery. The argument, relying on foreign suppliers for these goods, makes the U.S. vulnerable in a crisis. Section 232's broad definition of national security gives the president wide latitude. Legal experts warn this shift could make tariffs even harder to challenge. The trade conflict has simply moved to a new legal battlefield. The Supreme Court's decision brought immediate relief to businesses burdened by IEPA tariffs. With these duties gone, companies can lower costs, invest, and potentially reduce prices for consumers. Shoppers may see lower prices on goods like electronics, clothing, and appliances as tariffs disappear. American exporters hope foreign retaliatory tariffs will also be lifted, reopening global markets. However, the administration's shift to Section 232 means new tariffs could soon hit other products. Consumers might see prices fall for some goods, but rise for others, like cars and medical equipment. The economic uncertainty continues, as the trade war enters a new phase. Relief is real, but the broader conflict is far from over. The 2026 Supreme Court decision was more than a trade ruling. It was a landmark on presidential power. The court reaffirmed that only Congress can impose taxes and set trade policy, even in emergencies. This decision checks the trend of expanding executive authority and returns power to the legislative branch. Future presidents will need explicit congressional approval for broad tariffs, ensuring public debate. Yet, the administration's pivot to Section 232 shows the struggle over trade and executive power isn't over. Courts have historically deferred to the president on national security, making Section 232 a tougher challenge. The next legal battles will focus on what counts as national security and trade. The ruling clarified the rules, but the contest over America's trade future continues.